Well, thanks very much, Alex. It's an absolute privilege and a pleasure to be here with so many good friends from battles in the past. And it's been wonderful to be here as part of an academic environment. I'm not an academic, I'm an activist. And hopefully my contribution can perhaps be a little bit helpful in perhaps suggesting some ways forward. But I want to start off by saying that there's no hope for Australia apart from the way of Jesus of Nazareth. And I think we all agree with that. And that's why the work of the Dawson Centre, of course, in the work it plays to preserve the Christian religion in Australia is so vital, because that goes to the preservation of our very nation itself. And that's why it's a privilege to be here today participating in this colloquium. And I want to thank Dr. Daintree very much for the opportunity. And as I'm the last speaker before pre-dinner drinks, which I understand have been extended as a result of our shorter tea break, I'll make this snappy. My topic is picking up the tools of democracy before it's too late. This, of course, is the context of today's discussion around freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and trying to preserve these things, yet I don't think it's a case of preserving them any longer. We've lost them. It's a case of actually finding a way to restore them. My topic is inspired by something that was said to me over a lunch in Canberra a number of years ago, when I had the privilege of meeting with a gentleman by the name of Preston Manning, who had been the opposition leader in the Canadian Parliament from about 1997 to 2000. And we were discussing the appropriateness of Christian engagement in politics. This was in the years leading up to the 2017 marriage plebiscite. And there were some very strong Christian voices, mainly in the Protestant world, suggesting that we should stay out of politics, particularly noisy, loud voices like the Australian Christian Lobby, where I was working at the time, and we should concentrate on preaching, or at least, if we did get involved in politics, just stick to things like poverty and refugees, social justice type things, and stay silent on controversial cultural and political issues like same-sex marriage. But at this lunch, Manning leaned over the table at me and said something which was very, very helpful. He said, Christians should do what every free citizen in a society is entitled to do in a democracy, and that is pick up the tools of democracy and use them. And coming from a man who'd done exactly that and had almost had become Prime Minister of Canada, and who was a strong public Christian, that meant a lot. It was a crystallising moment. So this afternoon I want to argue three things, and some of it's already been covered today. Some of my thunder has been stolen, but repetition, I think, is the art of good education, is it not, Kevin? So I'm sure at this late hour of the day we'll be keen to be reminded of what we've been hearing today. But the first thing I want to say is that the 2017 same-sex marriage plebiscite, which has forever scarred and traumatised my life, was the seminal moment when we lost freedom of speech and freedom of religion in this nation. As I said, we're no longer in a battle to preserve them, it's a battle to restore them. Number two, that freedom of speech and freedom of religion will not be restored anytime soon by Labor or the so-called modern Liberals, the Greens or the Teals. The sad news is that the current political settlement between this quad, there's a quad, it's not India, Japan, America and Australia, there's a quad that runs politics in Australia. It's a red, blue, green, teal quad, and they're on a unity ticket, and they're not going to allow freedom of religion to be restored anytime soon. The third thing I want to suggest to us this afternoon, that is, if we want to see these freedoms restored, we must use the tools of democracy to create a partisan political movement so that these freedoms are on the ballot paper every time there's an election until they are secured once again. Now, the increasing illiberalism of our political and cultural elites means that we must build this movement before it's too late. So, loss of freedom of religion and freedom of speech. Now, there are so many warriors here in this room from the 2017 marriage campaign. It's like a happy reunion of those of us who fought the long defeat. Obviously, His Grace Archbishop Porteous, it's been lovely reconnecting with him today, and of course Alex. I very much enjoyed the time we spent in the trenches back in the lead-up and during that campaign. Monica, of course, who is here today, we work very closely with, and Dr. David Van Gend, who we'll hear from tonight, all played very key roles in this desperate but necessary rearguard action. Now, by naming names, I'm sure I've missed some out in this room who also made contributions. In fact, I'm sure there's not a person in this room who was not invested in the campaign in some way, shape or form, volunteering, door knocking, staffing telephone call centres or donating money. Thank you for all that you did. Monica, David and I, though, we found ourselves performing a public role as media spokespeople on behalf of the Coalition for Marriage, which was the campaign organisation that was formed to fight that battle. Now, in order to get a message across to a population who were ambivalent about or supportive of the love is love mantra, we took every opportunity to remind the Australian people that the marriage vote was a referendum on three things: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the rights of parents to protect their children from radical LGBTIQA+ indoctrination at school. At the time, Australian Marriage Equality took great exception to us ventilating these concerns, saying they had nothing to do with marriage equality. Nothing to see here, folks, it's all about love. But the ink was barely dry on the new legislation when Labor's Penny Wong, now our Foreign Minister, sought to shepherd a bill through the Parliament taking away the rights of religious schools to employ staff who share the parent community's beliefs about marriage. That was within less than 12 months. And it was only narrowly defeated in the Parliament, in the Senate, when the Centre Alliance Party declined to support it, much to the anger of Penny Wong and others. In fact, she was quite hysterical at the time. Within less than 12 months of same-sex marriage being legislated, the same-sex marriage campaign morphed into a permanent campaign machine called Equality Australia, run by one of the same-sex marriage campaign leaders, Anna Brown. Just because they won, the activists had no intention of laying down their weapons. Brown organises woke, top-tier law firms like Clayton Utz to go after Christian schools like Ballarat Christian College. If you don't believe me, you can Google all this stuff, simply because the college requires staff to uphold a Christian ethos on marriage. What's the board of a regional Christian school going to do when they get a legal letter from Clayton Utz? I mean, this is scary stuff, folks. We've seen attacks on City Point Christian College, Bundaberg Christian College, Westside Christian College, simply because they sought to exercise their pre-same-sex marriage rights when it comes to upholding a Christian ethos on marriage and the science of gender. On a personal level, I've been, in January 2020, I wrote a blog. That's what frustrated, washed-up political activists do. We blog. I heard about this thing called Drag Queen Storytime at Brisbane City Council Library. It blew up on social media. I noticed that one of the participants in a protest against the drag queens, a peaceful protest by a bunch of young people, I recognised one of them there as an acquaintance. So I did some research on what all the fuss was about. Sadly, the leader of that protest, a young man by the name of Wilson Gavin, ended his life the next day after a massive media backlash. He was a gay man himself, but that's another story. And so I started researching, well, who are these drag queens that were reading to children at the Brisbane City Council in January of 2020? And I found out that one was crowdfunding to have her breasts removed. She was presenting to the children as a man. And she later, as I understand it, did have her breasts removed. And the other was a man who boasted on his Facebook page about having won an X award from the Adult Entertainment X Awards. He also had obscene images on his Facebook page that any child with a device could readily find. So I wrote on my blog that these were not proper role models. In fact, I wrote that they were dangerous role models for children. Now, the drag queens then, after a few months, sued me in the Queensland Human Rights Commission, and the case now has been escalated to the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal. It's been dragging on for 2 years. It's cost $100,000 so far. I'm very thankful that I'm blessed to have had a bit of a public profile, and people have very kindly, mums and dads, funded my legal defence so far, and I'm very thankful for that. And I've got the Human Rights Law Alliance in Canberra, the law firm that we set up at ACL to help persecuted Christians. Little did I know that I thought I might need it one day. I just didn't think so soon. But I'm very thankful for the foresight of our board at ACL for setting this law firm up. Now, the Human Rights Law Alliance, they're very busy at the moment helping persecuted Christians. They receive no taxpayer money. But my opponents, they have engaged the LGBT legal service in South Brisbane, and I had a look at their annual report, and they receive hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars to assist them. So, the taxpayers are paying for the silencing of freedom of speech of people like me. It's outrageous. As for Australia is no longer a country with freedom of speech, freedom of religion, or freedom of association. As for radical LGBTIQA+ education in schools, well, there's hardly a school in the country where children are not subjected to gender-fluid ideology, Wear It Purple days, Pride Month observances, etc., etc. In Victoria, it is government policy for teachers to hide from parents a child's decision to transition his or her gender. I kid you not. Here's what the Victorian Department of Education's LGBTIQ student support policy, under the heading Parental Consent, says, quote, There may be circumstances in which students wish or need to undertake gender transition without the consent of their parents or carers, and or without consulting medical practitioners. If no agreement can be reached between the student and the parents regarding the student's gender identity, or if the parents will not consent to contents of a student support plan, it will be necessary for the school to consider whether the student is a mature minor, which means, end quote, which means, of course, the parents can be completely bypassed. Daniel Andrews thinks he owns the children of parents in the state of Victoria. This is chilling stuff. No government should require teachers to hide anything from parents, let alone a decision as potentially life-altering as gender transition. But hey, when we said the same-sex marriage plebiscite was a referendum on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, parents' rights, the Anna Browns of this world scoffed at us. So did the Rodney Crooms. The chilling effects on basic freedom since the marriage debate are with us daily. I recently received an email from Catherine, a public servant at a government commission in the state of Victoria. The email signature block helpfully told me that Catherine's pronouns were, you guessed it, she, her. Correction. If you guessed it after hearing the name Catherine, you're probably a bigot. Well, had Catherine been a so-called trans woman and I pushed back, I risked being dragged before a tribunal for offending someone on the basis of gender identity, which is a protected attribute under anti-discrimination law. Everyday Australians who know this is nonsense live in the fear of being reported by their colleagues at work who are wearing rainbow lanyards or ending their emails with their pronoun directives. I talk to pastors who tell me that they self-censor what they say from the pulpit. We're in the process of reforming Family First, and the first election that we are looking to contest, or second, we contested the South Australian election in March, is in Victoria. And we have churches there very keen. After years of pushback in Victoria from churches when I was with ACL, suddenly they want a political party because it's difficult to say from the pulpit what they want to say about Christian marriage, about the binary nature of gender, the science of gender even. And pastors are already self-censoring. This is a chilling thing. It should not have to be that way. There should be freedom in the pulpit to give religious and moral instruction to people about the nature of marriage and gender. Well, sure, some of what I've described was happening pre-2017, but it has been turbocharged since the law changed, as we said it would be. It's just happened more quickly than any of us thought. Now, as I said, I don't think there'll be any restoration of freedom of speech and freedom of religion anytime soon, and Monica has explained that brilliantly this afternoon, being a lawyer by background. I'll continue to say what I had prepared. It's slightly different, but related. But in the dying days of the marriage campaign, just weeks ahead of the November 2017 announcement of the result of the Australian marriage law postal plebiscite, our campaign about freedoms and parents' rights did bear some fruit. After interventions by former Prime Minister John Howard and former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson, the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull announced that he was setting up the Ruddock Commission into Religious Freedom. After a long and drawn-out process, during which the chairman of the commission, former Liberal Minister Philip Ruddock, bizarrely declared that there was no religious freedom issue in Australia, you might remember that, the Commission finally handed down a series of recommendations, including that there should be some legislation to protect religious freedom. Now, of course, this was all delayed through the COVID process, and finally a bill was brought forth in February of this year, as Monica said, and Equality Australia and the mainstream media characterised the bill as enabling religious schools to expel gay or transgender students, a power not sought or used by Christian schools. But that didn't matter to the Rainbow Lobby or the media, nor did it matter to them that Labor introduced such powers, i.e. the references to the Sex Discrimination Act of 2013, that Labor actually put those exemptions into that when they amended the Sex Discrimination Act in 2013. Very ironic. But nonetheless, the die was cast because of this narrative, and that became lethal in terms of the public perception. So Labor, the Greens and the so-called moderate Liberals, 5 of whom crossed the floor, teamed up to defeat religious freedom on the floor of the Parliament in February. Anthony Albanese has since promised to revisit the issue, making him the 3rd Prime Minister in 4 years to promise this. But here's why I don't think it will happen. Labor's policy, as enunciated in the latest edition of its national platform, is to provide taxpayer-funded sex change operations to LGBTIQ young people. Now, it doesn't say whether they're minors or not, it just says young people in the policy platform. It would be interesting if Labor would provide taxpayer-funded. Anthony Albanese should be asked that question because it's not clear. Now, that is just the tip of the iceberg, and Monica also quoted from their platform about other aspects of their policies. The Greens, of course, are just as radical as Labor, more so, but there's not much difference between the two parties on LGBT politics, identity politics. Now, the Liberals, of course, are facing yet another one of their identity crises in the wake of the lost election, having abandoned their Conservative base well and truly in the Turnbull-Morrison years. It's doubtful that the Liberals have the spine to argue for religious schools to be free, to hire staff and uphold their religious ethos when it comes to marriage and gender. Look at what the modern Liberals did to Fairness in Women's Sports campaigner Catherine Deves during this latest campaign. There were calls for her to be disendorsed. I mean, do you think a party that is going to do that to someone like Catherine Deves is going to legislate a religious freedom bill that allows Christian schools, to have the freedom to make sure that, Johnny doesn't wear a dress to the school formal or compete against the girls in the swimming carnival or shares their toilets and showers or sleeps in their dorms at the school camp? It's just not going to happen. Look at how Scott Morrison, who he remains in the Parliament, how he abandoned City Point Christian College at the first sound of grape shot. Now, admittedly, City Point perhaps had worded their enrolment contract a little indelicately, but they were just trying to do what the Ruddock Commission recommended, and that is that schools put their beliefs out publicly so that everyone can see, and so it's fair for parents and staff what the school believes in, so that no one is deceived into going into somewhere that might not be a good fit. But of course they were pilloried as part of an orchestrated activist campaign, and of course Scott Morrison threw them under the bus, which was very, very disappointing. The 4th group of the Quad that now dominates Australian political discourse are the newly minted Teals. They, of course, are all left-wing women who hold the same views as Labor and the Greens. The political Quad controls Australian politics and is on a unity ticket and will back the political agenda of the LGBTIQA+ activists over religious schools any day and over religious freedom. There is no political consensus for allowing religious schools to hire staff who believe the Christian view of marriage and gender. When it comes to freedom of speech, things are also grim. Not even the Abbott government had the stomach to sustain an argument to remove 18C, that's the anti-free speech provisions of the Federal Racial Discrimination Act, which allows action to be taken by someone who feels offended. Now, as Archbishop Porteous knows, we have 18C style provisions laced throughout our state-based anti-discrimination laws. And again, there isn't the stomach to address these. Who would have ever thought that we could become, in a country like Australia, that people can take this sort of legal action because they feel they've been offended or vilified, or that there's been some sort of hate speech that's ill-defined, and that then gives them a trigger to take action. The red, blue, green and now teal quad of Australian politics will not restore free speech, and I doubt very much that any meaningful protection for religious freedom will be legislated anytime soon. The game has long shifted from preserving freedom of speech to us needing to restore it, as I said earlier. Our freedoms were lost in the mail of the Australian Marriage Law Postal Survey in November 2017. So my lunch all those years ago where Preston Manning, seminal figure in Canadian politics who almost became Prime Minister, encouraged me to pick up the tools of democracy, that put a fresh spring in my step. At the time, many Christian leaders were looking for a permission structure to stay out of the same-sex marriage debate as the storm clouds gathered. It was polarising, and our opponents had cleverly painted anyone who disagreed as unloving, callous bigots who wanted to be seen to be on that side of the debate. Rather than wade in and publicly deconstruct the falsehoods that underpinned every presupposition and assertion behind redefining marriage, the majority of leaders wanted out of the public debate. In my view, the silence of leaders was a key reason we lost the 2017 plebiscite. The public only heard one side of the debate. We didn't have the fighters for truth that Alex was just talking to us about. Today, as an organiser for a minor political party seeking to have strong and courageous voices for life, family, faith and freedom, as defined by Dick Crowther, elected to our parliaments, the simple idea that I am free and entitled as much as any other citizen to pick up the tools of democracy gives me renewed boldness. There are lots of fine efforts in the culture wars, and we need every one of them. And what I'm proposing today is just one aspect of it. In fact, I'm convinced that one of the key missing ingredients in the battle for freedom of speech and freedom of religion is a partisan political movement that puts strong and courageous voices into Parliament who are willing to sustain the debate for freedom over a long period of time. Before I went to join the Australian Christian Lobby in 2007, I spent a brief period of time as a staffer for Senator Ron Boswell and Senator Barnaby Joyce. And it was very interesting. It gave me an interesting exposure to the federal parliament. We would go down for sitting weeks and I would watch the Greens get up every day and move notices of motion in the parliament. Now, notice of motion, symbolic, non-binding. You know, all the wise political heads would say, don't worry, Lyle, don't set your hair on fire. They're just the Greens being the Greens. It doesn't mean anything. We don't need to fight this. We don't need to contest this. They were getting up and moving notices of motions about, you know, why don't we close down the coal industry? Why don't we have gay marriage? And debating and arguing their case. And, of course, our side never responded. And they used the tools of democracy in ways that we on the conservative side of politics and the liberal side of politics haven't done. And the frustration that I felt as a lobbyist for 10 years with ACL, an organisation I deeply love and I'm thrilled to see going on to much bigger and better things in the years since I've left. And really it is the indispensable organisation in this nation. But the frustration I had after 10 years of pounding the halls of Parliament House in Canberra and other parliaments around the nation was having lots and lots of meetings with really, really good people who believe all the things that you and I believe in this room, but very few willing or able to sustain debate in the public square. And it's that missing. We live in an advocacy system and our side has not been advocating. And that's why I believe that we need to somehow raise up a political movement where there will be voices that are not constrained by the party machines, tapping them on the shoulder and saying, no, we've got to talk about the economy, you know, these are not the talking points, you know, we can't engage in all that culture war stuff, while the Greens and the Teals and Labor and the left of the Liberal Party all have a free rein in that space. Those days have got to end, and I can't see any other way to end it apart from raising up something that is hopefully a sensible voice on the centre-right of politics, on the minor party fringe, to try and do to the Liberal Party what the Greens have done to the Labor Party very effectively over the last 30 years. So, look, there's a lot more I could say, but that's my basic proposition today. I think that, yes, you know, it's wonderful the discussion we've had today. one way I think we can put legs on this discussion, in my humble opinion, and I submit to your consideration, is that we raise up a partisan political movement that can exercise its rights in picking up the tools of democracy to hopefully make a difference in the future. So thank you so much.